The foul stench hit Harold the moment he stepped past the towering gates of the old manufacturing complex. He paused, shining his flashlight across chipped walls and rusted machinery, his breath catching when he realized it wasn't just the smell of ordinary decay. It was oddly pungent, tinged with a sweet chemical odor that stood at odds with the usual sense of neglect and long-discarded metal. Weeks investigating the disappearances in the neighborhood had brought him here, and he couldn't help but feel an icy tremor in his gut. This place had a reputation. Some said it was cursed. Others claimed monsters stalked its halls at night. Rumors thrived, and Harold was about to confirm their truth or falsehood. His investigation started 3 weeks earlier, when 2 homeless individuals vanished after bedding down in a makeshift shelter near the loading docks behind the factory. Then, children began returning home from the surrounding neighborhoods with strange stories of tall, robed figures slipping through shadows. Reports of a foul odor drifting out of the old plant came soon after. Harold, newly minted as a freelance detective, took the case out of both curiosity and a sense of duty. Everyone else, even the authorities, seemed too petrified to intervene. It didn't take him long to realize something sinister was happening here, and he was determined to uncover it. He had spent days combing through city archives, learning the factory's shadowy past. It had once produced chemicals for the city's industrial sector, but a series of unexplainable accidents, workers burned by mysterious acids, entire shipments vanishing in broad daylight, brought it to bankruptcy decades ago. From there, the stories took a darker turn. Sightings of robed figures around the building at night, sudden bursts of greenish light from the top windows, and strange chanting echoing in the surrounding alleyways. Official records indicated the place had been sealed off, but the chain on the shattered gate told a different story. Harold moved deeper. The factory's main hall stood empty, but metal shutters had been pried open, revealing a labyrinth of rooms connected by half-collapsed corridors. Tattered tarps draped over old machinery like massive doorways to some underworld. He had been in dark places before, but this felt deeply unnatural. He swept his flashlight across the concrete floor, noticing drag marks leading toward a hallway on the far side. The rust-red streaks looked suspiciously like blood that had gone dry and flaked off. Summoning his courage, he followed the trail. The corridor turned sharply, and a strange glow emanated from beneath a set of double doors at its end. That glow pulsated in lazy rhythm, somehow calling to him. He positioned himself against the wall, quietly pressing his ear to the door. At first there was only silence, punctuated by distant dripping. Then came a low, resonant chanting. Harold couldn't make out the words, but it chilled him to the bone. Desperate for answers, he nudged the door open a crack. Flickering green flames played on the walls of a large production chamber with a network of rust-thickened pipes. In the center stood a tall figure wearing tattered black robes embroidered with runes. A cold wind seemed to emanate from him despite the stagnant air. Harold found himself crouching lower, trying to remain hidden. He watched the figure dip a large ladle into a vat of viscous, blackish liquid. The odor that wafted up made Harold gag silently. The swirling substance, now tinted with sickly green luminescence, sloshed into a cryptic symbol etched into the floor. Then, after pausing dramatically, the figure raised his arms and began a chant in an unfamiliar language, consonants rolling in a way that made Harold's skin crawl. He might not understand the words, yet he knew somehow they were infused with the power of death. The necromancer spoke, and the temperature dropped by several degrees. Enough for Harold to see his own breath. Suddenly, shapes began to move along the edges of the chamber. Heavy, limping forms, no longer alive, yet animated by dark magic. Harold's eyes widened as he saw rotted arms protruding from tarps cast aside like old curtains. These were once human, but no longer. Their flesh hung in slick patches, revealing bone and sinew beneath. There had to be at least a dozen of them. They shambled forward, an unholy mix of moaning and scraping across the concrete. Unable to remain a spectator to this horror any longer, Harold slid into the shadows behind a large piece of rusted equipment. He watched in shock as the necromancer drew the black fluid symbol on each reanimated form's chest. The stench was overpowering. When the necromancer spoke his final words in that guttural chant, the zombies stiffened, their sunken eyes abruptly blazing with the same green fire that shimmered in the vat. They were not mindless. Harold sensed a terrible intelligence breaching their emptiness. He realized these creatures, fueled by that liquefied malice, had become something worse than ordinary zombies. They were abominations with a purpose. Harold's foot slipped on a damp spot, knocking over a loose metal rod. The clang was deafening in the stillness. Every rotting head snapped in his direction. The necromancer paused mid-chant, and a cruel smile played on his lips beneath the hood. Harold sprang into action, leaping away from the overturned rod. A guttural cry left the necromancer's mouth, and the reanimated horde surged toward Harold in concert. He sprinted back to the door, heart pounding. One of the zombies, faster than its lumbering appearance suggested, snagged his coat. Harold tore himself free, stumbling out into the corridor and slamming the door behind him. He heard the wrenching of metal and scraping of undead nails against the steel. Racing down the corridor, Harold searched for an exit, or at least somewhere to hide. With the reanimated so close behind, he needed a plan beyond running blindly. He wondered if the city's old power junctions, which might still be accessible somewhere in this factory, could be used as a weapon. Electrical surges might have an effect on unnatural horrors. Quickening his pace, he recalled old schematics from the archive. If he was right, the main electrical distribution panel lay deeper in the factory, past the assembly lines. Minutes stretched like hours as he tore through half-collapsed walkways and over heaps of rusted components. He turned another corner and found a heavy double-doored entrance to what might have once been the quality control department. The doors creaked as he pushed them open, revealing an office space in ruins. Cubicles with smashed computers, old paperwork scattered on the floor, all covered under a thick layer of dust and grime. He could still hear that dreadful chanting from behind as the necromancer's minions made their steady pursuit. But it sounded more distant with each passing second. Hoping he'd gained enough time, he scanned for any sign of the distribution panel. A flicker of movement made him freeze. Out of the corner of his eye, an old desk lamp flickered to life, its bulb sputtering greenish-white light. Harold frowned. There was no electricity here. He stepped closer and realized the lamp's plug dangled free in mid-air. Something else powered that meager glow. And right next to the lamp, perched on the desk, was a ring-bound notebook. It was open to a page scrawled with frantic pen marks and archaic symbols. He recognized some of these marks from the necromancer's garment. Cautiously, he flipped the page, trying not to dwell on how the lamp was shining or how the temperature seemed to drop another few degrees. The notebook detailed experiments in bridging the gap between life and death. Its entries were signed only with an inscrutable flourish. The writer mentioned engineered ectoplasmic serum, something capable of bypassing the limitations of standard necromancy. Harold's scalp prickled. Each ingredient was listed: bodily fluids from the recently deceased, certain arcane herbs, and a catalyzing agent gleaned from the chemical refuse in the factory's hidden storage chambers. The experiments reached horrifying success. Subjects that retained rudimentary intellect and motor skills far surpassing normal undead. The final entries rambled about perfecting the serum to create a small army of unstoppable, reanimated creatures. Harold stuffed the notebook into his satchel, certain it was evidence he'd need. He dusted off the desk's drawers, searching for anything else. Under a stack of crumbling papers, he found a rusted key card, likely from the days when this place was operational. He slid it into his satchel as well and hurried on. Behind him, moans echoed in the hallway. They were relentless. They might not move quickly, but they never seemed to tire, and with the necromancer's magic commanding them, they'd find him eventually. Setting his jaw, Harold navigated through the office floor toward a ladder leading down to the basement locked behind a steel hatch. The keycard he'd discovered fit a slot near the hatch, A small red light turned green and the hatch unlocked, screeching as it swung open. Below reigned pitch-black darkness, but Harold's flashlight illuminated a steep set of metal steps that descended into a sub-level he hoped contained the power junction. He hurried down, each footstep mapping echoes in the confined space. The walls were thick with grime. Random wires hung overhead, occasionally sparking. The sub-level smelled of old chemicals and damp rot. Harold coughed, breathing through the edge of his jacket, and the bottom stood a steel door marked Electrical Control, Authorized Personnel Only. This time, it was unlocked. Inside, the room was small and claustrophobic, like an oversized utility closet. Along one wall was a series of old breaker panels, wires spooled and half-melted in some places. Harold's eyes scanned the flaking labels until he found what appeared to be a main breaker switch, big enough that it required both hands to move. He hesitated. If he restored power, it might help him fight back. There could be overhead lights, perhaps functioning security systems, or an electric current to overcharge some part of the factory. However, switching the power back on could also energize whatever arcane contraptions the necromancer might have set up. Hoping for the lesser of two evils, Harold pulled the giant lever. Sparks danced around the panel, and the overhead lights in the sub-level flickered. Faint noise behind him made him spin around. Standing in the darkness of the corridor leading back up was one of the reanimated unholy sentinel. Its entire body twitched with every green pulse that emanated from its glowing eyes. The creature snarled, revealing blackened teeth. Harold grabbed a broken length of pipe from the floor, the only makeshift weapon he saw. The zombie lunged with surprising speed, slamming into him. They both stumbled into the corridor, crashing to the ground. Harold tried to keep the snapping jaws away from his face, struggling to not be pinned. Incensed green eyes bored into his own. Mustering his strength, he jammed the pipe through the creature's ribcage. Something cracked. A thick, rancid liquid oozed from the wound. The abomination shrieked, staggering. Harold rose and swung his flashlight's heavy end at its skull. There was a satisfying crunch, and the zombie collapsed in a foul heap. His relief was short-lived, as more moans filtered down the corridor. He could smell the necromancer's unholy thralls even before he saw them. Harold sprinted away, searching for another exit. The corridor opened onto a cramped side passage that twisted deeper beneath the factory. He wanted to return above ground, but the undead had effectively blocked the route behind him. Reluctantly, he ventured further into the unknown below, noticing new lights flickering to life from the recently reactivated power grid. He passed a room that looked like a laboratory, with glass beakers and tubes all coated in dust. He didn't stop to investigate. Survival overrode curiosity. As he hurried, something about the architecture seemed to shift. Concrete gave way to old, corroded metal of factories. Sub-level extended further than any blueprint he'd read. Eventually, he found himself in a large chamber, dominated by a massive cylindrical machine in the center. Rusted walkways circled the machine, with black, tar-like residue pooling beneath it. A sense of deep unease nagged at him. He remembered reading about experimental disposal of chemical waste and how unscrupulous individuals had used this company's old equipment to churn out toxins. Could the necromancer have found a way to harness all that industrial filth to power his vile craft? A heavy slam behind him confirmed the presence of more undead. Panicked, Harold dashed up a flight of metal stairs onto a grated walkway. He realized he was trapped above the large machine, with no obvious escape. The undead were climbing the steps, each step accompanied by moaning that set his teeth on edge. Thinking quickly, Harold saw a console on the walkway's far side, presumably controlling the massive cylinder below. If he could overload it, or flood the area with something, maybe he could destroy these abominations en masse. Adrenaline spiked as he leaped over missing sections of the walkway, sometimes forced to cling precariously to avoid a fall into the rancid pools beneath. Reaching the console, he found multiple levers and dials. Most of the labels had peeled off. With only seconds to make a decision, he yanked the largest lever downward. A guttural roar echoed from the machinery, and it began chugging to life, shuddering like a beast rising from dormancy. Lights flickered inside the cylinder, unveiling swirling chemicals. The necromancer's undead closed in, their glowing eyes turned skyward to watch the machine. Something about this reactivated device seemed to agitate them. Limbs twitched even more violently, and they let out wails that sounded almost afraid. A figure emerged from the gloom on the walkway below, tall and robed, exuding an unholy aura. The necromancer had come. Even from across the chamber, Harold felt the necromancer's staring eyes. The green luminescence in his pupils glowed with the intensity of a neon sign, his voice reverberating like a demon's snarl across the metal walls. "You dare interfere with my work?" he thundered, striding closer. "Do you know what forces you are trifling with?" Harold lifted his chin. "I don't care what power you've stolen. You won't be using innocent people to fuel your monstrosities." The necromancer's laugh was hollow, as if forced from a grave. "Innocence? They serve their purpose. I bring forth a new age, forging an alliance between the flesh of the dead and the hidden energies trapped in these rotting walls." A thunderous vibration emanated from the machinery, forcing Harold to brace himself against the console. A monitor flickered to life. Warning messages scrolled across the screen. Pressure building. Overload imminent. He realized, with a surge of desperation, that the entire device would blow if not shut off. A plan formed in his mind. If the machine exploded, it might cleanse the factory with enough force to wipe out the necromantic presence. But it could also kill him, and possibly scatter the necromancer's malevolent magic far beyond the factory. That was the risk. Harold couldn't be sure the necromancer's power wouldn't linger, but if he didn't act, the city was doomed to suffer a plague of the undead. He slammed another lever, hoping to redirect the build-up, but the ancient control panel emitted only sparks. The necromancer strode forward, raising a bony hand alive with black flame. Shadows congealed along his arm, forming a tendril of dark magic that lashed out. Harold barely dodged, the tendril striking the railing and dissolving the metal instantly. "I will not be stopped by a mere mortal," roared the necromancer. With another outstretch of his hand, two of the reanimated abominations lurched onto the upper walkway flanking Harold. Unarmed except for his flashlight and the pipe he'd held, Harold brandished both like makeshift weapons. One undead creature lurched at him, vicious nails raking his jacket. He knocked it back with a desperate swing of the pipe. The second lunged low, grabbing his ankle. Harold kicked free, ignoring the searing pain in his foot. He glanced warily at the necromancer, who seemed content to let his creations finish the job. Time was running out. Alarms on the console were now flashing red. Overload was imminent. Using the pipe as leverage, Harold pried open a nearby gauge fixture. He recognized enough to guess it might manually vent part of the chemical mixture. If he could flood the walkway with the super-pressurized coolant or toxic slime, maybe it could incapacitate the undead. Or lay a trap for the necromancer. Hastily twisting the valve, he unleashed a geyser of black corrosive fluid that arced across the walkway. It splashed onto the nearest abomination, sizzling on contact. The creature shrieked, stumbling back. The second abomination pressed forward, ignoring the chemical burn. Harold wrenched the valve harder, directing the flow. The undead staggered, its flesh melting away under the corrosive torrent. The necromancer let out a savage roar. Realizing his creations were in danger, he extended both arms, conjuring a barrier of flickering green and black flames. The fluid splashed onto the magical barrier and spattered harmlessly away. But in that instant, Harold noticed the necromancer's focus shift from the overloaded machine. Sparks rained from the console. If the necromancer ignored the overload, the entire chamber might blow, annihilating them all. Yet Harold suspected the necromancer had a failsafe, or a way to protect himself. Seeing no other option, Harold sprang behind the console and grabbed the main lever once more, pushing it back up. Steam hissed from the machine, and the pressure gauge soared into the red zone. The necromancer turned his glare on Harold. "Fool, you'll destroy everything!" He rushed forward, chanting in that same guttural language. A tide of swirling darkness stretched between them, hungry to crush Harold's will. Harold slumped, feeling himself drowning in the necromancer's words. His flashlight fell from his grasp, clattering on the metal walkway, its beam spinning. Darkness pressed in on him, unraveling his consciousness, but a flicker of determination sparked within him as he recalled the terrified faces of those who had gone missing, everyone who lived in the neighborhood. The possibility of unleashing an unstoppable necromantic threat upon helpless citizens. Summoning his last reserves of will, Harold forced himself to stand upright. The swirling blackness felt like thick tar, clawing at his resolve. He managed to lift his left hand and dig into his satchel, retrieving the notebook containing all the necromancer's research. With wavering eyesight, he saw the symbols in the flickering light. Some part of him realized certain lines were instructions on how to disrupt necromantic bindings. Although he lacked the skill or time to cast a complex counterspell, the final paragraph described an emergency measure. A reversal incantation to sever a necromancer's control for at least a brief critical window. Uttering the hackneyed words in a broken chant, Harold stumbled through the foreign syllables. The effect was immediate yet ragged. The necromancer reeled backwards, as though punched in the gut. His eyes narrowed and the swirling blackness around Harold receded slightly. A furious snarl escaped the necromancer's lips. "You dare speak those words?" With a sudden break in concentration, the reanimated horde trembled, uncertain. No longer under the strict mental yoke, they paused, swaying. Some toppled to the floor, the green light in their eyes flickering erratically. The necromancer tried to reassert his power, lifting his hands, but Harold repeated the incantation. The necromancer's concentration cracked further, and the final spark needed for a cataclysm took hold in the massive machine. It let out an explosive roar that made the walkway tremble. Fractures shuddered through the cylinder, sending jets of hot liquid and steam across the chamber. The necromancer realized too late what was happening. Harold grabbed the railing to keep his balance, feeling the entire sublevel quake. Before the necromancer could conjure a barrier, the cylinder ruptured in a deafening explosion. Flames and a billowing green-hued cloud of toxic vapor filled the chamber, swallowing everything. The impact threw Harold backwards, slamming his head against the walkway. His world spun into blackness. When he stirred, coughs racking his body, the air was barely breathable. Flickers of smoldering debris lit the chamber, revealing twisted metal and collapsed walkways. Green flames danced across shattered remains of the reanimation vats. Liquid hissed in rivulets, forming small toxic streams. Harold peered around, half expecting the necromancer to appear triumphantly from the smoke. Instead, he saw no movement, save for swirling dust and the occasional shifting of a toppled beam. Gaining his footing, he forced himself to climb over a fallen support girder. Dead eyes stared at him from scattered corpses of the once reanimated. The necromancer's rebellion wave had severed their bond, and the subsequent explosion finished them off. Their bodies lay in final repose, no glow left to animate their twisted limbs. Across the charred remains, Harold glimpsed a shredded fragment of a black robe. There was a spatter of thick, dark fluid and a skeletal arm. He felt a shiver of relief. It seemed the necromancer had perished, or was so gravely wounded that he would no longer pose a threat. The trek back to the surface was a slow, painful odyssey. He had to navigate collapsed stairwells and find alternative corridors half choked by debris. Occasionally, emergency lights flickered overhead, an after-effect of reactivated power and the subsequent destruction. Each step brought him closer to the night air, and when at last he emerged into the main hall, he nearly collapsed under the starry sky visible through the broken roof. The city lights flickered distantly. Dawn was hours away, but a faint glow touched the horizon. He could see movement outside the gate, figures with flashlights, the cavalry of a sort, local law enforcement, search parties, or perhaps a few brave vigilantes. Harold made a silent vow that, once he recovered, he would turn the necromancer's notebook over to authorities, or even to an expert in arcane phenomena. It might help them guard against future dangers. Humanity was fragile, and dark forces, if left unchecked, would inevitably rise again. For now, however, the immediate threat was gone. Nobody challenged him as he made his way out. He'd suffer bruises, perhaps a concussion, and definitely more than a few nightmares. The caretaker of the local homeless shelter would want an explanation, and the city might hush it all up, labeling it the bizarre accident of a derelict factory. Yet Harold knew the truth. The grudging sense of responsibility weighed heavily on his shoulders. If twisted magic grew again in the cracks of the urban sprawl, he would do what he must to snuff it out. He felt no grand sense of victory, only relief that the undead had been halted and the necromancer's vile ambitions crushed in the explosion's inferno. Later, standing outside in the cold night air, Harold coughed up dust, letting the adrenaline fade from his system. Sirens approached in the distance. He clutched the satchel containing the necromancer's tome. That dangerous knowledge needed to be locked away or destroyed. Clouds of debris seeped into the sky over the factory, like the last exhalation of the necromancer's unholy presence. Harsh floodlights lit up the perimeter. Police cars skidded to a halt, and armed officers rushed in, the bravest stepping gingerly over shattered concrete and twisted metal. Harold raised a weak hand in greeting. Officials swarmed him, urging him to an ambulance. Questions about the meltdown, the explosion, and the missing people sparked around him, but his thoughts reeled in exhaustion. As paramedics guided him gently into the back of the vehicle, Harold tilted his head up. The pre-dawn sky had a hint of pink, and the moon hung low, silver and uncaring. He closed his eyes, his breath uneven. Behind him, the ruined factory loomed, its broken windows staring like haunted eyes into the night. He wondered how long the darkness would truly remain banished. Even if the occult residue were cleansed, the spectre of necromancy hovered, a threat that could be conjured somewhere else, by someone else. Another twisted soul might discover the vile secrets that festered in ancient tomes and abandoned industrial corners. But as the ambulance doors closed, and he felt the small stab of a needle administering painkillers, Harold clung to a single certainty. For tonight at least, the horrors that had once stirred in that factory had been laid to rest. If they ever rose again, he would be ready bruised, but determined. Armed with knowledge of the darkness and a defiant spark of light, the city would remain peaceful in its unknowing slumber, the old factory left to smoulder for a while, until the wrecking crew arrived. Nobody would mourn its destruction, and should any future necromancer seek to siphon the remnants of that industrial malevolence, they would discover nothing but rust, rubble, and ashes of a plan violently undone. Indeed, the night they rose would be remembered only by those who witnessed or heard rumor of undead moans and flickering green lights, urban legends best whispered in hushed tones. Let those stories stand as a warning about the line between life and death and the dreadful sorcery that awaits any who dare to cross it. For now, the night was over, and with it, the reign of that dark necromancer in the old factory's halls.